provides. I'm a lecturer at UCL. Super happy to share with you on Urban Mining 1.0. We actually look at how we can decolonize generative design through biomimicry and cultural syncretic design. So the project is actually co-created between me and my team members. We are architectural technologists, computational designer, and I specialize in digital engagement. So architecture design has long looked into nature for inspiration, and nature indeed provides us with 3.8 billion years of architectural R&D. For instance, we can look at how different trees' branching structure can offer more better structural support in increasingly flooding areas, and so on. However, this process today is supercharged by the digital technology. For instance, we use algorithm to encode process. This is a project that I was working with my peers at UCL, Alberto, Davi, and Nicoletta. And what we did was that we trained a neural network to optimize the evolutionary algorithm from a pixel and voxelized oriented process. So what we do is that we simulate the environment, the amount of sun instances in an environment, we discretize the instances, and we try to teach a generative adversarial network to learn from layers of these pixels. However, at the end of the project, we realized that one of the risks was that we marginalized local understanding of what building aesthetic was. And it was very difficult for us to actually replicate local aesthetic with this sort of generative algorithm. And so this provoked me to think of a sequential project to question how we can embed both environmental and cultural intelligences through computational workflow. So it's not just biomimicry, but also vernacular mimicry. So to truly situate design practice, we have to look into post-colonial contexts, because those are hybrid contexts that struggle a lot with what identity means to a city today. And so we take vernacular culture not simply as a relic, but as an urban mind, which is very rich with culture and inspirational resources to be claimed for sustainable and just architectural futures. Now, to understand where we are today, I've looked at a lot of biomimicry installation in biennales worldwide, and we try to look at how they are at the same time green, sustainable, and generalizable to different contexts, but at the same time, they're also normative, and most of the time, because of the algorithm, they carry colonial residues. For instance, scholars like Arturo Escobar critique the universalization of Eurocentric optimization logic. This systematically sideline other ways of knowing, and it's not simply theoretical. If you look at the cases here, we see that the common thread is reduction, that complex, culturally rich systems are reduced to standardized, scalable data points. Which is why, in response, increasingly decolonial scholarship try to use generative geometry with cultural lineage, material intelligence, participatory construction, and urban activation as the 5 key principles to decolonize generative design. And what this implies is that we need to look for the line between local and colonial, which are often blurred today. Because imagine, for instance, I came from Hong Kong. How do you define Hong Kong, Chinese, or Western influences in the HSBC building, right? Because modern material, international structural analysis, whereas local belief in feng shui are all mixed in the same design. So it's super hard to define what is design justice in this case. This leads us to think about what are the systematic framework that can help us try to put numerical values over a design to quantify the quality. And we propose the 3R framework, which is roots, residue, and resistance. Cultural root question how we can have design that reflect local culture. How can we quantify what's foreign, what is familiar, or what is ancestral? Colonial residue look at how design can be erased by globalized complexity. For instance, are the design embedding one-sided, partial, or balanced perspective of local and global? And finally, community resistance look at how much the design distort local history. For instance, does it feel like it's oppressing other culture, or is the community voice clear in the design? We did a series of design experiments. Phase 1, develop a modular interlocking system. Phase 2, infuse the system with traditional patterns and physics. Phase 3, diversify the solution space with biomimicry growth simulation. And finally, we synthesize all of the lessons learned into a real-world project where we have a client in Jordan. So this was one of the foundations. we created this interlock modular system inspired by biological form and Haeckel's lithographies with Chinese joinery. The components were essentially locked together through the elasticity of the prototyping material. In this case, it's the cardboard, so we don't require any adhesive. It is a proxy for scalable construction logic. However, on its own, it's culturally abstract. So overall, it's an algorithmic blueprint that can be adapted to other regional topology. And phase 2 was crucial because we tried to infuse the interlock system with cultural logic. What we did was that we took a continuous space-filling Hilbert curve and code that as a mathematical algorithm, and we subjected it to physics simulation. We applied loads and fixed the anchor points at the classical support location, like the 4 edges. And then across the periphery, we tried to mimic principles of traditional Chinese architecture where the edge bears both a load and a decorative significance. And in the next step, we tried to use that and ground it to touch the floor, because that's when architecture happens. So we used a growth simulation to simulate the branching structure, allowing the pattern to emerge from physical forces. And then we abstract the sections and simulating the elevation of the edge. So this let the algorithm review where the patterns would naturally meet the ground as a form of support. And in the final phase, we designed an orthopedic hospital in Jordan, and train as an architect, we always take inspiration from the function of the building. Orthopedic is essentially a bone hospital, so we try to look at how our algorithm can encode bone structure for load distribution. So internally in a bone hospital, there's a lot of machinic, they're very heavy, they're put in specific location that will actually stresses the whole load distribution of the building. And so we try to refine our pipeline to distribute the point load through a facade geometry. And we take inspiration from bone and also vernacular architecture. So the algorithm, what it did was that it tried to eliminate additional material by doing a lightweight optimized design. The pattern emerged from the load requirement across floors, so we have X, Y, Z direction, which is like bone density adapting to stress. So this becomes biomimicry in terms of function. And in terms of aesthetic, we try to learn from different local architecture. In the first one is a Western African earthen hut. It takes parabolic form and use thick mud so that it can resist gravity and lateral forces through pure mass and geometry. And the second type we learned from Art Deco, which was actually inspired by Egyptian geometry, but then taken by the West. And it has the potential to diagnose bracing where the structure can bear the load and aesthetic at the same time. We've obviously got Islamic arches, which are built from repeating stone modules and distribute weight through compression. So this enables spanning with minimal material. And finally, we use desert geometry in mud facades. It combines structural solidity with passive ventilation for solar and shading. So across these, we generate 4 different designs using our algorithm mimicking these different aesthetics. And in the next step, we try to evaluate which design was better. And we actually did it with a Jordanian client. But actually, he didn't prefer the Islamic design because the historical resonance was too strong. He also rejected the Art Deco design because it also assimilates a colonial influence. And he thinks that the vernacular mud houses was too much symbolic than functional and being taken out of context. And so finally, we can see that over the phases and over the scoring system, we finally chose one of the first design because the scoring evolved 3, 5, 3, 5, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4. So eventually it didn't actually stabilize. It stabilized, but not reaching the highest standard that we want. However, by working with the client, we have more local insights over vernacular aesthetics and what they think was colonial and decolonial. And that became an important decision pathway that we think can be generalized to other design processes. As you can see, the negotiation was a branching of decision from cultural motives, pattern recognition, structural physics to clients' actual needs. And these components are consistently interacting, and they form a feedback loop. And in the end, we have the decolonial lens of the 3L framework, and if none of this time work, we have to face reality that we have to repeat the process again, and this is what is actually happening here. But we think the value is not to demote designer agency, but actually help us to engage in critical self-reflection so that we can shift the work from abstract hybridity to more community responsive architecture. And sure, in these sort of experimental stage, we need to invest time and energy, but then we also argue that the research can help frame colonial legacy in architecture as the hegemonic persistence of universal design paradigm. That the counter-practice is the method of generative syncretism supported by a self-audit of the 3R framework. So we have demonstrated a process that transmutes two-dimensional cultural pattern into three-dimensional structure that can be responsive to gravitational forces at the same time cultural memory. However, due to the results, we also have to acknowledge the limitations. That largely the computational tools we use are still embedded with power asymmetry. The practical constraint, like construction regulation, it also mandate foreign engineering collaboration, and so that exposes the neo-colonial structure persist in the globalized practice. We have not solved all of the contradictions, and actually in the potential urban-rural biases, in the process we could also romanticize craft labor, and we simplify the complex identity remain in real designs. And so in the next step, we intend to continue the whole exploration. We will do physical prototyping. We will try to generalize the pipeline with other cultural geometries. So welcome to collaborate with us. And also, we need to further improve the pipeline so that we're not repeating colonial residue in the results. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very, very much for sharing.